Get that garbage off my flight line. Captain Dylan Cross snatched the microphone from the announcer's hand and laughed loud enough for the entire flight line to hear. He pointed directly at Rachel Morgan's aircraft. The crowd turned. Pilots snickered. Ground crew looked away. Rachel stood 10 feet from him. She heard every single word. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just kept tightening her harness with steady hands. And that moment, that one arrogant, careless moment, was the beginning of something Dylan Cross would spend the rest of his career trying to live down. If you're new here, subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning started the way most mornings did at Silver Ridge Air Base, with noise, with purpose, and with the particular kind of restless energy that only lives in places where people fly fast machines for a living. The Nevada sun had barely cleared the mountains when the first engines began their warm-up cycles. The sound rolled across the tarmac in waves, low and mechanical and deeply satisfying to anyone who had spent years around aircraft. It was the kind of sound that told experienced people the day was serious, that whatever was about to happen mattered. Silver Ridge was not a casual place. It never had been. The base had a reputation built over decades, a reputation for producing some of the finest military pilots in the country, for hosting evaluations that determined careers, and for air demonstrations that attracted observers from the highest levels of the Department of Defense. When Silver Ridge put on a show, people paid attention, which is exactly why what happened that morning felt so strange to everyone who witnessed it. Because the first thing anyone noticed before the crowd arrived, before the cameras set up, before the brass settled into their viewing chairs, was the truck. It was old, faded blue, maybe once darker, with a rear bumper held in place by what appeared to be a combination of rust and hope. It came through the main gate at exactly 7:42 in the morning, passed through security with paperwork that the guard studied for an unusually long time before waving it through, and pulled across the tarmac to the far end of the staging area. A woman climbed out. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, maybe older, with dark hair pulled back simply and a flight suit that had clearly seen more years than most of the pilots on the base. She didn't look around. She didn't wave to anyone. She walked directly to the transport trailer attached to the truck and began unstrapping the aircraft secured to it with the practiced, unhurried movements of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Her aircraft was not modern. That was the diplomatic way to say it. The less diplomatic way, the way it was actually described on the flight line within the first hour of her arrival, was that the thing looked like something pulled from a museum. A modified aerobatic aircraft, propeller-driven, with a paint job that suggested it had once been impressive and had since faded into something that was merely functional. Nobody knew who she was. That was the second strange thing. At Silver Ridge, everybody knew everybody. The base operated on a network of reputation and record. You knew who the rising stars were. You knew who had just returned from deployment. You knew who the evaluators liked and who they didn't. Information moved through a military installation, the way water moves downhill constantly, naturally, and usually before anyone decided it should. But nobody had heard of Rachel Morgan. That name appeared on the approved demonstration list. Civilian guest aerobatic demonstration, 1 aircraft, and when people looked for more, they found almost nothing. A Nevada pilot's license, a registration for the aircraft, an authorization letter with a signature above a title that several people had to look up. The authorization came from a general nobody had met in person. That part was unusual enough that people noticed it and then quickly decided not to ask questions about it out loud. Captain Dylan Cross asked questions out loud. Dylan Cross was 29 years old and had been told he was exceptional for so long that he had come to accept it as simply accurate rather than flattering. He had graduated near the top of his class. He had accumulated flight hours at a rate that impressed his supervisors. He had a natural feel for aircraft that some pilots develop over careers and some are simply born with, and Dylan had been born with it, which meant he had never quite understood what it cost people who hadn't. He was talented. He was disciplined. He worked hard. He was also in the way that extremely gifted young people sometimes are not particularly good at imagining that anyone older or quieter or less obviously impressive than himself might have something he lacked. When he saw Rachel Morgan's aircraft, he stopped walking. Lieutenant Marcus Webb was beside him. Marcus was 26, newer to the base, still in that early phase of his career, where he was paying close attention to everything because He understood he didn't know enough yet to know what to ignore. He noticed Dylan stopping and followed his gaze. "What is that?" Dylan asked. "Aerobatic aircraft," Marcus said. "Modified, older platform." "How old?" Marcus looked more carefully. "Old? Maybe I don't know. 25 years might be more." Dylan turned to the nearest ground crew member. "Who signed off on that thing flying in our demonstration?" The ground crew member, a young airman who clearly recognized that this conversation was above his comfort level, said something non-committal and found somewhere else to be. Dylan turned back to the aircraft. Rachel was working on it alone, checking panels, running her hands along the fuselage, examining the propeller, with the focused attention of someone doing a pre-flight inspection seriously rather than as a formality. "Someone actually approved this," Dylan said. He didn't lower his voice. He wasn't speaking to Marcus particularly or to anyone in particular. It was the kind of statement that's meant to land in the general air around a person to make sure it gets heard without requiring direct delivery. Rachel heard it. She looked up for exactly 2 seconds, met Dylan's eyes, and then looked back at her aircraft. She didn't say anything. She didn't react. She just kept working. This bothered Dylan more than any sharp response would have. He was used to reactions. He was used to people either defending themselves or deferring to him, and both of those he knew how to handle. Silence from someone who clearly heard him and chose not to engage, that was different. He filed it away somewhere behind his confidence and kept moving toward the briefing area. Marcus watched Rachel for another moment before following. She was checking the control surfaces, now moving each one slowly, feeling for resistance or abnormality with her fingertips. It was basic procedure. Everyone did it, but something about the way she did it made Marcus pause. She wasn't checking boxes. She was actually feeling for something. Her eyes were unfocused, pointed slightly away from what her hands were doing, in the particular way of someone who has learned to trust sensation over sight. He almost said something to her. Then Dylan called his name from 30 feet away, and Marcus jogged to catch up. The morning briefing for the demonstration pilots was held in a room just off the main hangar. There were 12 pilots in the demonstration roster, 11 military, 1 civilian listed at the bottom as guest performer aerobatic. The briefing officer ran through the sequence, the timing, the safety corridors, the abort procedures. Rachel sat in the back row. She was the only person in the room who didn't know anyone else. She was also the only person in the room who seemed completely unbothered by this fact. She sat with a small notebook and made quiet, precise notes. She asked one question about the wind forecast for the specific 2-hour window of the demonstration, and when she received the answer, she wrote it down and said nothing else. Dylan, sitting 3 rows ahead, heard the question, and something about it stuck under his skin like a splinter. It was too specific, not the kind of question a pilot asks when they're nervous about performance. It was the kind of question you ask when you're calculating something, when you're planning something that depends on natural conditions, not just mechanical ones. He turned to the pilot beside him and said quietly enough to be private, but not quiet enough to be silent. "I don't know what she's planning, but if she goes up in that thing and embarrasses this base in front of the evaluation team, somebody is going to hear about it." The pilot beside him nodded with the particular non-committal nod of someone who agreed enough to agree, but not enough to attach their name to it. After the briefing, the pilots moved to the flight line. The base had filled up with the day's arrivals, technical staff, observers from command, civilian contractors, a photography team that was documenting the demonstration for some project that hadn't been fully explained to anyone below a certain pay grade. The crowd that gathered along the viewing area was smaller than a public air show, but more concentrated in expertise. These were people who knew what they were looking at. Rachel knew that. She returned to her aircraft and continued her preparation. Where the other pilots moved through their pre-flight checks in the efficient 20-minute rhythm of practice routine, Rachel took twice as long, not because she was uncertain, because she was thorough. There was a difference, and the people who knew aviation well enough could see it, even if they didn't yet respect what they were seeing. She pulled out a folded sheet of paper, handwritten notes, not a printed form, and went through items in a sequence that didn't match standard pre-flight protocol. It matched something else, something personal, and developed over time. One of the ground crew working near her aircraft, a staff sergeant named Ortega, who had been at Silver Ridge for 11 years, watched her for a few minutes and then did something unusual. He offered to help. Most civilian performers at military demonstrations were treated with polite professional distance. It was nothing personal. It was hierarchy and habit. But Ortega had seen something he recognized. "Anything you need, ma'am?" he asked. Rachel looked up. She assessed him in about half a second. "Fuel state good. Topped and balanced this morning. Checked twice. Weather Service updated the thermal layer estimate at 0900. I can get that for you. Please." Ortega went. He came back 5 minutes later with a printed sheet. Rachel studied it for longer than seemed necessary and then folded it and put it in her breast pocket. "Thank you," she said. "Then you've worked around aerobatic aircraft before." It wasn't a question. "Some," Ortega said. "Civilian side before I enlisted. 3 years." Rachel nodded. "Then you know the difference between a show pilot and a recovery pilot." Ortega looked at her for a moment. "Yes, ma'am." "Which one do you think I am?" He looked at the aircraft. He looked at the care she'd taken with her inspection. He thought about the specific question about thermals and the handwritten checklist that didn't match any published procedure. "Recovery pilot," he said. Rachel almost smiled. "Not quite, but almost. Watch the demonstration," she said. "Don't watch me. Watch the aircraft. There's a difference." Ortega didn't entirely understand what she meant, but he remembered it. The demonstration sequence began at 11 o'clock. Silver Ridge's skies were clear by Nevada standards, high visibility, manageable crosswind, the kind of conditions that made for clean performances and easy photography. The evaluation team settled into their chairs. The photographer team positioned themselves. The morning energy of preparation collapsed into the taut, focused quiet that always precedes a flight demonstration. The military pilots went first as scheduled. They were genuinely impressive. These were experienced aviators in aircraft that represented the current edge of military capability, and they performed with the precision that years of training and institutional support produce. Tight formations, aggressive maneuvers executed cleanly. The crowd responded with the appreciative near silence of people who understand what they're watching and reserve their reactions for the moments that earn them. Dylan Cross flew fourth in the sequence. He was objectively the best pilot in the military roster that day. Even people who found his personality difficult had no legitimate argument with his flying. He executed his solo segment with a combination of technical precision and natural confidence that was genuinely remarkable. Clean rolls, controlled dives, a sustained inverted pass at low altitude that drew the first real collective response from the watching crowd. When he landed and climbed out of his aircraft, he allowed himself the small satisfaction of knowing he had delivered. He accepted the nods from the evaluation team with the practiced modesty of someone who is actually not particularly modest. Then the announcer's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, our final performer today is a civilian guest pilot flying a modified aircraft. Please welcome Miss Rachel Morgan." There was polite applause. Rachel's aircraft taxied onto the runway. Dylan leaned against a safety barrier with his arms crossed. Beside him, 3 other pilots gathered. Someone made a quiet remark about the aircraft's age. Someone else noted the sound of the engine slightly different from what they expected, a deeper frequency, something modified. They assumed it was a cheap alteration. It was not, but they didn't know that yet. Rachel taxied to the threshold and paused. Everyone who later tried to describe what happened next reached for words and usually felt them fall a little short. Because what Rachel Morgan did in the first 60 seconds of her demonstration was not about spectacular maneuvers or high-speed passes or anything designed to create a dramatic impression. It was something subtler, and subtler things in aviation are often more difficult. She lifted off from the runway with a cross-wind correction that several of the watching pilots simultaneously recognized as more precise than it needed to be for existing conditions. Not just precise anticipatory, she had adjusted for a gust that hadn't arrived yet when she made the correction. When the gust hit 3/4 of a second later, the aircraft moved through it without any visible effect. One of the senior pilots in the evaluation team, a colonel who had flown for 22 years and had seen enough demonstrations to develop a deep immunity to being impressed, straightened slightly in his chair. He didn't say anything. He just watched more carefully. Rachel climbed steeply and then made a series of transitions that built on each other in a sequence that looked to the untrained eye like a standard aerobatic routine. Rolls, loops, direction reversals. Technically accomplished, but unremarkable perhaps. Except that Marcus Webb, standing near the flight line with a clear sight line to the aircraft, was watching the way she flew rather than what she flew, and he was noticing something. Every maneuver Rachel performed was connected to the next one, not in the way of a rehearsed routine where the connection is a matter of timing and sequence learned on the ground, in the way of continuous calculation. She was reading the air in real time and adjusting in real time, and the result was a flight that looked smooth because it was actually responsive, because she was making small corrections constantly that prevented the aircraft from ever reaching a state where a large correction was necessary. It was like watching someone walk across ice and realizing they never slipped because their weight was never wrong. Marcus didn't have words for this yet. He was 26. He filed the observation somewhere and kept watching. Dylan Cross was not watching with the same attention. He had made his assessment and he was comfortable with it. Technically sound, he would have said, if asked. Nothing remarkable. The aircraft was the ceiling, not the pilot. A better aircraft and she'd be a better performer. This was not an analysis. It was a posture. But Dylan didn't know that yet either. Then Rachel did something that nobody on the flight line expected. She entered a flat spin. In a small aerobatic aircraft, a flat spin is a controlled demonstration of a very specific type of emergency. The aircraft rotates around its vertical axis while descending with almost no forward motion, a condition that, if encountered accidentally, is one of the most difficult to recover from in all of aviation. The techniques for recovery are specific and counterintuitive and require a pilot to act against every instinct that says, pull up 80 power, fight the rotation. Watching someone enter a flat spin intentionally at an air demonstration is already unusual. Watching them do it at low altitude is something else entirely. Rachel entered the spin at what the evaluation team later measured at 3,000 feet, acceptable but not generous. She rotated through 4 full turns. The aircraft descended. The crowd, which had been politely attentive, went very quiet. Dylan Cross unfolded his arms. 5 turns. The colonel in the evaluation seating leaned forward in his chair. 6 turns, and then Rachel recovered. The recovery was there is really only one way to describe this. It was clean. Not dramatic, not last second. She applied the counter inputs in exactly the right sequence, at exactly the right moment, and the aircraft transitioned from rotation to controlled flight with the kind of smoothness that is only possible when every element of the recovery has been precisely timed. She climbed out of the recovery, made one low pass over the field, and landed. The tarmac was quiet for almost 4 full seconds after her wheels touched down. Then the colonel began to clap. Not applause. One colonel clapping, measured, slow, deliberate. The kind of clapping that means something specific in a room of people who understand what they just watched. Others joined, not all of them, not immediately, but enough. Dylan Cross did not clap. He stared at the aircraft taxiing toward the staging area, and he said nothing. Marcus Webb, standing near the flight line, realized his notebook was still in his hand, and he hadn't written a single word. He looked down at the blank page and then back at the aircraft and then back at the blank page. He wrote 2 words, recovery pilot. He stared at them for a long moment. Ortega, 20 feet away, caught his eye. The staff sergeant nodded once, the kind of nod that says, yes, you saw what you saw, and yes, it was what you think it was. Rachel climbed out of her aircraft without ceremony. She removed her helmet, shook out her hair, and walked toward the water station set up near the staging area. She poured herself a cup. She drank it standing up, looking at nothing in particular. She did not look toward the crowd. She did not look toward the evaluation team. She certainly did not look toward Dylan Cross. But Dylan Cross walked toward her. He crossed the tarmac with the particular stride of someone who has something to say and has decided to say it regardless of whether it's wise. He reached her and stopped. That was a flat spin recovery, he said. Rachel drank her water. At low altitude, he continued. Yes, Rachel said, that's not an aerobatic trick. She looked at him then. No, she said, it's not. Where did you learn that? She looked at him for a moment, and it was the kind of look that takes stock of a person that measures distance and decides how much to cross. Experience, she said finally. What kind of experience? Rachel set down her cup. The kind, she said, that you don't go looking for. She walked away. Dylan stood there in the middle of the tarmac Nevada sun overhead, surrounded by people who had just watched something he didn't have vocabulary for yet. And for the first time in a long time, Captain Dylan Cross had no answer for what he was feeling. Marcus Webb had been watching from 30 feet away. When Dylan turned and walked back toward the flight line, Marcus stayed where he was. He looked down at his notebook again. 2 words recovery pilot sitting in blue ink on a white page. He looked at the aircraft, then slowly he walked toward it. I wasn't sure why. He told himself he was curious about the modifications. That was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that he had watched Rachel Morgan fly and something had moved in him. Some understanding that hadn't been there before, not fully formed, not named, but present. The feeling that he had just seen something important without yet knowing what it was or what it meant for him. He reached the aircraft. He looked at it the way she had looked at it, the way Ortega had looked at it, not as a spectator, but as someone trying to understand. And then he saw it, barely visible beneath the layers of the repainted cockpit area worn down by time and weather, and the deliberate or accidental application of something that had almost removed it. 2 words. Faded. Barely there. Ghostwriter. Marcus stared at those 2 words for a long moment. Then he took out his phone, typed the call sign into a search, found almost nothing. A mention here, a reference there, a comment in an aviation forum that said simply classified. He stood in the Nevada heat beside an aging aircraft with 2 faded words on its side, and he understood with a certainty he couldn't yet fully explain that the woman who had just performed a low-altitude flat spin recovery in front of an entire military base had done it the way she had for one simple reason. Because she had done it before, not in a demonstration, not for practice, for real. And everything, the old truck, the faded flight suit, the aging aircraft, the quiet, the refusal to argue, the flat calm in the face of mockery, all of it began to arrange itself into a shape that Marcus Webb was only beginning to understand. He closed his phone, he looked at the 2 faded words, and he thought ghostwriter. Who are you? The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across Silver Ridge. The demonstration was over. The evaluation team was in conversation, notebooks out, speaking in the focused, quiet tones of people processing what they'd seen. The photographer packed equipment. Ground crew began moving aircraft. Rachel Morgan was preparing to secure her own aircraft for the night. She worked alone. Nobody helped her. Nobody approached her. The base had the slightly dazed quality of a place that had expected one thing and received another and was still working out what to do about the difference. Dylan Cross sat in the briefing room with 2 other pilots. He hadn't said much since his conversation with Rachel on the tarmac. The pilots around him had filled the silence with their own assessments, technically impressive, unusual repertoire, good aircraft handling, and Dylan had nodded in the right places without contributing. He was thinking about a specific thing she had said, the kind of experience you don't go looking for. I was turning that over, examining it the way he examined technical problems from different angles, looking for the load-bearing element, trying to understand the structure. He had been looking for something he could diminish, something that would put her performance back in a category he understood and could rank himself above. He couldn't find it. The flat spin recovery sat there in his memory, immovable and precise, and every time he tried to find a technical criticism, altitude, too conservative, recovery, too early, input, timing off, the critic in him came back empty. She had done it correctly. She had done it the way it should be done. And he couldn't explain why that bothered him more than if she had done it wrong. Sergeant Ortega was finishing his own end-of-day tasks when he passed near the room where the evaluation team had gathered. He wasn't trying to overhear anything. He heard something anyway. The colonel speaking to his aide. Find out who authorized the civilians' participation. I want to understand the full background, because that flat spin recovery was not a demonstration of aerobatic skill. A pause. That was a demonstration of emergency procedure. And I want to know what emergencies she survived to fly it that way. Ortega kept walking. He went back to his work area, sat down, and pulled up a search terminal. He typed ghostwriter call sign military aviation. The results were minimal, a few references, one that was partially visible before a redirect. A forum post that began with the words back when ghostwriter was still active before it was edited and the continuation removed. Still active was. Ortega leaned back in his chair. He thought about what Rachel had said to him that morning. Watch the aircraft, not me. There's a difference. And then he thought about the flat spin recovery and the way she had entered it, not hesitantly, not with the controlled drama of someone performing for effect, but with the matter-of-fact precision of someone executing a familiar procedure. Too familiar, not demonstration familiar, Actual familiar. He closed the terminal. Outside, the Nevada evening was coming in. The light was changing in the way desert light does, fast, absolute, the sky going from gold to deep blue without much negotiation in between. Rachel Morgan secured the last restraint on her aircraft, checked it twice, and stood up straight. She looked at the sky for a moment, not at anything in particular, not with longing or calculation, just the way that people who spend their lives in the air sometimes look at the sky when they're on the ground checking in. Making note, then she picked up her bag, walked to her truck, and drove off the base. She left behind an aircraft with faded paint and two barely visible words beneath the cockpit. And she left behind a base full of people who had started the day assuming they knew exactly who she was. None of them had gone home with that assumption intact. The next morning would bring orders from command. The next morning would bring a classified test. The next morning would bring the situation that none of them, not Dylan, not Marcus, not the colonel, not anyone, was prepared for. But that first evening, Silver Ridge simply sat with the day it had been given. And somewhere in the back of 11 different minds, pilots, crew observers, one sergeant at a search terminal, a name was beginning to form. Quiet as a whisper, exact as a bearing, ghostwriter. Marcus Webb did not sleep well that night. He lay on his bunk in the officers' quarters, staring at the ceiling and turning two words over and over in his mind, the way you turn a stone in your hand when you sense something underneath it but cannot see what it is. Ghostwriter. He had written them in his notebook. He had typed them into a search terminal. He had found almost nothing, and somehow the almost nothing was more unsettling than a complete blank would have been. A complete blank meant it didn't exist. Almost nothing meant it existed somewhere that most people weren't allowed to look. He got up at 5:45 earlier than required and went to the flight line. Rachel's aircraft was still there, secured under a temporary canopy that Ortega's crew had set up without being asked. Marcus stood in front of it in the early morning quiet, the Nevada air still cold from the night, and looked at the two faded words beneath the cockpit. Ghostwriter. He crouched down to see them better. The paint underneath the current coat was slightly different in texture, not just faded, but deliberately covered over imperfectly at some point in the past. Someone had painted over that name, not completely, not successfully. It had bled back through the way certain things bleed back through, no matter how hard you try to cover them. He heard footsteps behind him and straightened up. It was Ortega. The sergeant carried 2 cups of coffee and extended one without comment. Marcus took it. They stood together looking at the aircraft. You found it, Ortega said. Last night, Marcus said. You knew it was there. I noticed it during the pre-flight check, before she arrived. Ortega drank his coffee. I didn't say anything because it wasn't my business to say anything. Did you look it up? A pause. I tried. And I found a reference in a Adobe archive index that listed Ghostwriter as a classified operational call sign, active status. Unknown records restricted above my clearance level. Ortega looked at him. Above my clearance level, Lieutenant. I've been in this Air Force for 11 years. Most things aren't above my clearance level. Marcus absorbed that. She flew that flat spin recovery, he said, like it was a procedure she'd run before. It was a procedure she'd run before, Ortega said. That's exactly what it was. I worked civilian aerobatics for 3 years before I enlisted, and I've been around military demonstration teams for 8 years since. I know what a rehearsed trick looks like, and I know what a remembered procedure looks like. That was not a trick. They stood in silence for a moment. Where is she? Marcus asked. Base Hotel. She checked in last night. She's here through the end of the week. There's a secondary evaluation scheduled that I think she's part of, though nobody's been officially briefed on it yet. Marcus looked at the name again. And Ghostwriter. Somebody sent her here, he said quietly. Somebody at a level high enough to make it happen without explaining it to anyone below that level. That's not a coincidence. That's not a civilian guest spot. Ortega said nothing, which was his way of agreeing. Marcus finished his coffee, handed back the cup, and went to find Dylan Cross. Dylan was in the pilot's ready room at 6:20, already in his flight suit, working through a technical manual with the focused intensity he applied to everything related to flying. It was one of the things Marcus genuinely respected about him. Whatever else Dylan was, he was never lazy about the craft. Marcus sat down across from him. I need to show you something, Marcus said. Briefing isn't for another hour. This isn't about the briefing. Dylan looked up. Something in Marcus's tone landed differently than usual. He closed the manual. Marcus put his notebook on the table between them, opened it to the page with the two words. Dylan looked at them. What is that? It's written on her aircraft, beneath the cockpit, under the repaint. Dylan picked up the notebook, studied it. Ghostwriter, he said. His voice was flat, unreadable. That's a call sign. Classified call sign. DoD archive listed as restricted above staff sergeant level clearance. Ortega found that last night. Dylan set the notebook down. Could be anything. Could be a vanity name. Civilian pilots name their aircraft all kinds of things. Civilian pilots don't get their vanity names classified above staff sergeant clearance. Dylan was quiet for a moment. What are you saying, Marcus? I'm saying she isn't what she looks like. I'm saying whoever put her in our demonstration roster knew exactly who she was and decided not to tell us. And I'm saying the flat spin recovery she performed yesterday was not a showpiece. It was a procedure, a real one. And I want to know what situation made her practice it enough times that she can execute it at low altitude without apparent stress. Dylan looked at the two words again. His jaw was tight. She could have just said that, he said. When I talked to her on the tarmac, when I asked her about her experience, she could have explained herself. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. She didn't owe you an explanation, Dylan. The silence that followed had weight. Dylan picked up his manual, then he set it down again. He was not, Marcus could see, entirely comfortable with what he was sitting with. Good, Marcus thought. He shouldn't be. The morning briefing for the secondary evaluation came at 9 o'clock, and it changed everything. The base commander, Colonel Patricia Haynes, ran the briefing herself. That alone was unusual. Colonel Haynes delegated briefings. She appeared for significant events and decisions. Her presence in the room created an immediate adjustment in the atmosphere. Spines straightened, notebooks opened, the particular alert quality of people who understand that something real is happening. She began without preamble. As of this morning, Silver Ridge is hosting a priority evaluation of the Falcon 7 prototype aircraft. The evaluation will include a full flight test series beginning tomorrow morning. The test pilot assigned is Major Kevin Lark, who most of you know. What you don't know, because you haven't been briefed until now, is that the evaluation team includes a civilian technical advisor. She paused. Rachel Morgan. The room didn't erupt. Military rooms don't erupt. But the quality of silence shifted distinctly, and several people exchanged glances in the particular way of people who have just heard something that rearranges what they thought they understood. Dylan Cross did not look at Marcus. Marcus looked at Dylan. Ms. Morgan, Colonel Haynes continued, has been brought in at the request of the evaluation authority based on her background in flight dynamics and emergency recovery analysis. The specifics of her background are not your concern. Her role in this evaluation is, she will be present in the command center during all flight test phases. Her input will be treated with the same weight as that of the engineering team. Any questions about this? Silence. Not the comfortable kind. Good, said Colonel Haynes and moved on. Afterward, Dylan cornered Marcus in the hallway. Emergency recovery analysis, he said. I heard it. That's what she does. That's her background. She analyzes emergency recoveries. He paused. Or she performs them. Marcus said nothing. Ghostwriter, Dylan said, quietly this time. Not the dismissive way he'd said it in the ready room. The way you say something when you're beginning to understand it weighs more than you thought. The Falcon 7 arrived on a transport aircraft just before noon. It was moved into the secure hangar with the kind of careful attention that valuable and complicated things receive slowly, with people watching every inch of the process, with a security perimeter that the base's regular personnel were quietly redirected around. Marcus managed to look at it through the hangar doors during the brief window before they closed. It was extraordinary, the kind of aircraft that made you understand why people dedicated their entire professional lives to aerospace engineering. Lean and purposeful, with lines that suggested speed without announcing it, with control surfaces in configurations that didn't match anything currently in operational service. Major Kevin Lark was introduced to the evaluation team in a brief ceremony that afternoon. He was 34, experienced, calm in the way of test pilots who have made their peace with professional risk. He shook hands efficiently, asked focused technical questions of the engineering team, and treated the entire event with the serious competence it deserved. He was introduced to Rachel last. He shook her hand. I've read the advisory notes, he said. Good insight on the control surface sensitivity analysis. Rachel said, The flutter threshold on the secondary control system is narrower than the specs indicate. I'd want to stay conservative on the high-speed passes. Lark looked at the chief engineer, a man named Dr. Philip Warren, who had the slightly thin patience of someone who has been told about a potential problem he doesn't believe is actually a problem. The flutter analysis was completed to full specification, Warren said. I know, Rachel said. I read the analysis. I'm saying the real-world threshold is narrower than the modeled one. I'd want buffer room. On what basis? On the basis of having seen what happens when the model is wrong. Warren looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has spent decades in engineering and has made peace with being right most of the time, and has not made equivalent peace with being questioned. The model isn't wrong, he said. Rachel didn't argue. She nodded once the way people nod when they've said what they needed to say and understand that the conversation is over. But Lark Marcus noticed was watching her carefully, and something in his face suggested he had filed what she said in a location where he could retrieve it quickly. That evening, Marcus found Rachel in the base cafeteria eating alone at a corner table with a technical manual spread open beside her plate. He hesitated in the doorway, then walked over. Mind if I sit? She looked up, the same quick assessment he'd noticed the first time. Go ahead. He sat. He didn't say anything immediately, which seemed to either not bother her or not register. She went back to the manual. He looked at it, Flight Dynamics Advanced Recovery Analysis pages dense with equations and procedure flows that were well beyond his current training level. Lieutenant Webb, she said without looking up, you've been wanting to ask me something since yesterday afternoon. He felt caught. Is it that obvious? You watched my aircraft for 20 minutes after I landed. You came to the flight line at 6 in the morning. She turned a page. So ask. He thought about how to frame it, then decided framing was probably unnecessary. Ghost Rider, he said. She stopped reading. She didn't look up immediately. She set her hand flat on the page, not gripping it, just resting there. A quiet pause that lasted exactly long enough to be intentional. Then she looked at him. Where did you see that? Beneath the cockpit. The repaint didn't fully cover it. She looked at him for a moment. No, she said. I suppose it didn't. Is that your call sign? Was, she said. Past tense. What kind of missions? The kind with restricted records. I figured that much out. She almost smiled. Almost. Then you figured out as much as you're authorized to know. He leaned forward slightly. You told Dr. Warren the flutter threshold was narrower than the model. He didn't believe you. Dr. Warren is a very competent engineer. His model is excellent work. But models are built from the data we have. Reality includes data we don't have yet. She closed the manual. I've seen 3 aircraft with flutter analysis errors. 2 of them resulted in incidents. One of them, she stopped. One of them was not recoverable. The words landed quietly and stayed. You were there, Marcus asked. I was there. He processed that. The Falcon 7, he said. You think there's a real risk? I think there's a risk worth being conservative about, which is a different thing. She picked up her coffee. Your Captain Cross would tell you that conservative is another word for timid. Captain Cross says a lot of things. Yes, she said, he does. She paused. He's a good pilot, Lieutenant, a genuinely good pilot. I want you to understand that I know that. Marcus studied her face. But good pilots and wise pilots aren't always the same person. And the difference between them isn't talent or skill or even experience. She looked at her coffee. It's what they've lost, what they've had to carry afterward. Good pilots sometimes become wise ones. Sometimes they don't get the chance. The cafeteria was quiet around them, late enough that most people had cleared out. What did you lose? Marcus asked. She was quiet for a long moment. Enough, she said finally, and it landed exactly the same way it had when she'd said it to Dylan on the tarmac, not as evasion, but as an answer so complete it didn't need elaboration. She stood up, collected her manual, and picked up her tray. Get some sleep, Lieutenant. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. She was right, but not in the way he expected. At 6:58 the next morning, 11 minutes before the scheduled start of the Falcon 7's first test flight, Rachel arrived at the command center carrying her notebook in a folded printed document that she placed in front of Colonel Haynes without comment. Haynes looked at it. What am I reading? Updated flutter analysis. I ran a comparative model last night using data from 3 previous prototype programs with similar control surface configurations. The secondary control flutter threshold in two of those programs differed from their specs by a margin of 9 to 12%. She tapped the document. If the Falcon 7's threshold follows the same pattern, the high-speed pass in today's test sequence enters the margin. Warren was standing 3 feet away. He had heard every word. That analysis wasn't requested, he said. No, Rachel said. It wasn't. It uses data from programs that aren't directly comparable. They're comparable enough to be worth knowing about. Warren turned to Colonel Haynes. Colonel, the flight test sequence has been approved through full engineering review. I have every confidence in Dr. Warren, Colonel Haynes said, not sharply, but with a finality that closed the sentence he was in the middle of. She looked at Rachel. What are you recommending? Take the high-speed pass 15% below planned velocity. Get the data from there first. If it's clean, you can push the edge in a later sequence when you know more. Haynes looked at the document, looked at Warren, looked at Rachel. Major Lark, she said to the pilot standing quietly near the flight planning console. You've heard this, Lark said. I heard it yesterday. I thought about it last night. A pause. I'd like to fly her recommendation. Warren's face went through something complicated. Haynes said, then we fly the recommendation, adjust the test sequence. I want the revised parameters in Major Lark's hands in 20 minutes. Warren left to do the work. He did it without another word because Colonel Haynes had a quality that made secondary arguments feel wasteful of everyone's time. Dylan Cross, who had been standing near the back of the command center and who had been completely silent through all of this, looked at Rachel as she picked up her notebook. He said nothing. She didn't look at him. But something had shifted and both of them felt it, and Marcus watching from 10 feet away felt it too. The Falcon 7 lifted off at 7:32. The command center was quiet in the focused technical way of people doing their jobs carefully. Data feeds scrolled across multiple screens. Lark's voice came through crisp and professional, calling out test points and system status with the calm efficiency of a pilot who has learned to treat the unusual as routine. The first phase of the test went cleanly. Lark took the aircraft through its initial flight envelope configuration. Changes system checks, low-speed handling, and the data came back well inside expected parameters. Warren's team watched the numbers with the focused attention of people who are simultaneously hoping to be right and prepared for the possibility of not being. The data was good. Warren visibly relaxed. He exchanged a look with one of his engineers. The look said, I told you so, but politely. Then came the high-speed phase. At the revised velocity, 15% below the original planned speed, Lark called out the test point and pushed the Falcon 7 into its acceleration profile. For 14 seconds, everything was perfect. And then the stabilization system triggered an alert. Not a failure, an alert, a yellow band warning on the secondary control channel that appeared held for 3 seconds and then resolved. In the command center, everyone who had been relaxed was no longer relaxed. Rachel was looking at the data feed on the screen directly in front of her. She was not alarmed. She was reading. Her eyes moved across the numbers with the particular speed of someone who has seen these numbers before and knows what they mean. Warren moved to the same screen. That's with intolerance. That alert appeared at 112 knots below the original test velocity, Rachel said. She said it evenly, the way you state a fact when you want the fact to be heard clearly. If we had flown the original profile, it resolved, Warren said. Alerts that appear and resolve are telling you something is at the edge. If we had been at the original planned velocity, when that alert appeared, we would not have been at the edge. She looked at him. We would have been past it. Warren stared at the data. The room was very quiet. Lark's voice came through the headset. Command, I'm seeing the same data you're seeing. Secondary control channel alert at current velocity. Recommend we hold at this test point. Colonel Haynes said, confirmed, Major Lark. Hold your current test point. She turned. Everyone in the room at some level turned. Rachel was writing in her notebook, not performing, not looking around to see how her moment was landing. Writing down what she had seen, what it meant, what the next steps should be. She finished writing. She looked up at Dr. Warren. Your model is excellent work, she said, exactly as she had said it the night before. The flutter threshold is narrower than the model predicted. Now you have the data to update it. She paused. That's what test programs are for. Warren looked at her for a long moment. The man who had spent 3 decades in aerospace engineering, who had built careers on the accuracy of his models, who had not received gracious correction easily in a very long time, looked at her. Yes, he said quietly. It is. It was, Marcus would think later, one of the most significant things he heard during his time at Silver Ridge. Not Rachel's warning, not the data, not even the near miss. The yes, coming from Warren, said that way. That was the moment the room understood what they were dealing with. Dylan Cross was standing near the door. He had been standing there for the last 4 minutes without moving. His arms were at his sides. His face was unreadable. Marcus watched him. Dylan's eyes were on Rachel, still, unmoving. He wasn't judging anymore. Marcus could tell because he knew Dylan's face well enough to know what judgment looked like on it. And this was different. This was something in the territory between reckoning and recognition, the specific expression of a person who is updating something fundamental and finding the update uncomfortable. Rachel set down her pen. She looked at the data screen one more time. Then she looked at Colonel Haynes. I'd recommend suspending the high-speed test sequence until the Flutter model is updated with today's data. The remainder of the test card should be flyable with appropriate margins. She paused. Major Lark should make the final call on that. He's the one who's been in the aircraft. Haynes nodded. Agreed. She looked at Lark's data feed. Major Lark, we're suspending the high-speed sequence. Your call on the remainder of the test card. Copy that, Lark said. I'll complete the low-speed handling data and bring her home. Rachel picked up her notebook, excused herself quietly from Colonel Haynes, and walked toward the door. Dylan Cross was directly in her path. She reached him and stopped. He looked at her. She looked back. Yesterday, he said, when I asked about your experience. He stopped. Started again. When I asked where you learned the flat spin recovery. Yes, she said. You said the kind of experience you don't go looking for. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the command center continued its work to data analysis communication with Lark, the focused technical noise of a facility doing serious things. But the space between Dylan and Rachel had a stillness inside it. What happened, he asked, and his voice had changed. It was not the voice of a man asking a question he expects to rank himself against. It was the voice of a man who has begun to understand he doesn't know enough to rank at all. Rachel looked at him. She said, ask me that question again in a few days, Captain. Why a few days? Because right now you're asking me because you feel like you should. In a few days, if you still want to know, you'll be asking me because you actually need to. She walked past him. Dylan stood there. Marcus moved to stand beside him. They watched her walk down the corridor, notebook under her arm, faded flight suit, no apparent awareness of the room she'd just reordered, with 3 words to an engineer and a remembered emergency and a recommendation that had potentially saved a test pilot's life. Dylan, Marcus said quietly. Dylan said nothing. She knew, Marcus said. She knew before the aircraft went up. She ran her own analysis the night before. She came in with the document ready before anyone asked, before anyone could tell her it wasn't her place. Dylan was still quiet. That's not just experience, Marcus said. I know what it is, Dylan said. His voice was flat, not with the flatness of dismissal, with the flatness of a man holding something heavy and trying to keep his face level while he does. He turned and walked back into the command center. Marcus watched him go. Then he looked down the corridor where Rachel had disappeared. Ghost Rider, he was starting to understand what that name had cost. Not in the dramatic way, not the clean, cinematic cost of legend, in the actual way, in the weight behind the eyes way, in the way that makes a person check every system themselves and run models the night before, and stand quietly in the face of contempt, without flinching because they understand, at a level that cannot be taught in a classroom or a briefing room, or even a decade of clean, successful missions, that the cost of being wrong is not professional, it is permanent. That understanding lived in Rachel Morgan the way it lives in anyone who has earned it. Not like a scar, like a compass, always pointing toward the thing that matters, away from glory, toward home. And somewhere in the building, in a room full of data feeds and engineering models, in the quiet aftermath of a near miss that most people on the base didn't yet fully understand had occurred, Dr. Philip Warren was sitting at a workstation updating a Flutter analysis with numbers he hadn't expected to need. He worked carefully. He worked without complaint. And once during that work, he paused and looked at a spot on the wall where nothing particular was located, and the expression on his face was one that his colleagues had never quite seen there before. It looked, if you had to name it, like respect, the earned kind, the kind that doesn't come from resumes or rankings or rank. The kind that comes from being right when it counts quietly without needing anyone to announce it. Somewhere across the base, Rachel Morgan was at a desk with her notebook writing. She was not thinking about Dylan Cross. She was not thinking about Dr. Warren. She was not thinking about the command center or the alert that had appeared on the secondary control channel or the revised test sequence or any of the things that were currently reverberating through the professional consciousness of Silver Ridge Air Base. She was thinking about tomorrow's weather. She was thinking about the thermal layer in the wind forecast, in the behavior of the updated aircraft in conditions she hadn't fully mapped yet. She was thinking about the things that mattered, the way she always had, the way Ghost Rider always had, even when nobody was watching, especially then. The alert from the day before should have been enough. It wasn't. Not because people were careless, not because they ignored what had happened, but because human beings have a particular way of processing near misses. They feel the relief first, and sometimes the relief is so strong it quietly overwrites the warning. The aircraft had stabilized. The test had continued. Major Lark had brought the Falcon 7 home cleanly, and that clean landing had a way of making the alert feel smaller in retrospect than it had felt in the moment. Warren's team worked through the night updating the flutter model. By 6 in the morning, they had revised parameters, updated margins, and a new test sequence that Warren presented to Colonel Haynes with the careful precision of a man who has been corrected and is determined to show he takes correction seriously. Haynes reviewed it. Rachel reviewed it beside her standing, not sitting, notebook in hand. She read it twice. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "The updated flutter threshold is better. The margins are better. There's still one thing." Warren looked at her. His expression had changed since yesterday. The resistance was still there that doesn't disappear in a person overnight, but it had a different quality now. It was the resistance of a man who has updated his model and is not entirely comfortable with the fact that his model needed updating, which is different from the resistance of a man who believes he is simply right. "The tertiary pitch input under asymmetric load," Rachel said. She opened her notebook and sat on the table between them. Her handwriting was precise, the equations clean. If the secondary control system generates a correction pulse while the aircraft is in asymmetric loading, bank angle above 30 degrees with differential fuel state, the combined input could exceed the revised flutter threshold even at the new planned velocities. Warren looked at the notebook. His chief engineer leaned in. The room was quiet. "That's a very specific scenario," Warren said. "Yes," Rachel said, "it is. The probability of that exact combination song is low," she said. "I know. Most things that bring aircraft down are low probability. That's what makes them surprises." She met his eyes. "I'm not saying it will happen. I'm saying it's worth knowing about before Major Lark is in the air." Warren looked at the equations for a long moment. He picked up a pen. He started working through it beside her numbers. 3 minutes later, he set the pen down. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The expression on his face said it clearly enough. She was right. Again. Haynes looked at the notation. "How do we address it?" "Fuel balance protocol before the high-speed sequence," Rachel said. "Keep differential below 4%. It adds 10 minutes to the pre-sequence checklist, but it closes the scenario completely. Can we implement that by this morning's test window?" "I already wrote the protocol," Rachel said. She turned a page in her notebook and laid it open. A full procedural outline, step by step, timing and verification points included. Warren stared at the page. "You wrote that last night," he said. "Yes. Before we even agreed there was a problem." "I knew there was a problem," she said simply. Not arrogantly, the way you state the temperature when you have already read the thermometer. Haynes looked at Lark, who had been standing quietly near the flight planning console with the particular focused stillness of a test pilot, listening to people discuss the aircraft he is about to fly. "Major Lark," she said, "your call." Lark said, "I want the fuel balance protocol. I want 10 extra minutes on the checklist. I want to know every scenario Ms. Morgan has identified before I strap into that aircraft." He looked at Rachel. "Everything, not just the ones with low probability, all of them." Rachel said, "That'll take about an hour." "I have an hour," Lark said. "Let's start now." They sat together for 58 minutes in the briefing room off the main hangar. Lark, Rachel, Warren, and Warren's chief engineer. Marcus was allowed to stay by Haynes's direct instruction, though nobody explained why. He sat against the wall with his notebook and listened to a conversation that he would remember with unusual clarity for the rest of his career. Rachel went through every scenario she had identified. Some of them Warren's team had already modeled. Some of them they hadn't. For each one, she described not just the technical parameters, but the sequence of events, how it would develop, what the pilot would feel, what the instruments would show, and critically, what the natural instinct would be, and why following that instinct would make things worse. Lark listened with the total stillness of a person processing information they intend to use. At one point, he said, "The overcorrection loop you're describing on the secondary system, is that what you saw yesterday? The alert that appeared and resolved?" "Yes," Rachel said. "The system corrected, then it overcorrected the correction. The loop damped before it became critical because we were below the original test velocity. At the original planned speed, the loop wouldn't have damped." "How do you know what the loop would have done at higher speed?" "Because I've seen it at higher speed," she said. Lark looked at her. The question was in his face, not his mouth. "Different aircraft," she said, "different program. The system architecture was similar." She paused. The outcome was not good. The room was quiet. "What happened to the pilot?" Lark asked. "He walked away," she said, "because of what he did in the first 4 seconds after the loop started." Another pause. "And because of what I told him to do in those 4 seconds." "You were in the command center?" "Yes." "And you knew what was happening?" "Yes." "How?" Rachel looked at him steadily. "Because I'd been in that aircraft, not that specific aircraft, but I had been in that specific situation. And when it started happening to him, I recognized it before the instruments showed it clearly." She paused. "The instruments caught up about 2 seconds later." Lark sat back in his chair. 2 seconds, he said. 2 seconds is a long time in a deteriorating aircraft. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "it is." Warren, who had been very quiet for the last 20 minutes, said, "Ms. Morgan, the program you're referring to, was that documented in the review materials I should have access to?" "Some of it," she said, "the parts that were unclassified." "And the parts that weren't," she looked at him, "were classified." He nodded once. "Then what you're working from some of what you know, it's not in any document I've been able to read." "That's correct." He processed this with the visible discomfort of an engineer who has spent his career trusting documentation. "That's a difficult thing to build a margin around." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here, so you don't have to build around it blind." Warren picked up his pen again. He made a note. He didn't look up when he said quietly, "I owe you an apology, Ms. Morgan, from yesterday." Rachel said, "You were doing your job. I was dismissing your concern without full information." "Engineers and pilots have been doing that to each other for as long as aircraft have existed," she said. Not harshly, just accurately. "It's not a personal failing. It's a structural problem. I've been trying to help fix it for 20 years. Warren looked up. "Is that why you do this civilian advisory work?" She thought about the question for a moment. "Someone has to remember what the models don't know yet," she said. The briefing room held that sentence for a long moment. Then Lark said, "Let's get the protocol implemented. I want to be in the air by 10. At 9:47, the Falcon 7 rolled out of the secure hangar. The test sequence began at 10:12. Marcus was in the command center. Dylan was there too, not required, not briefed into the evaluation team, but present with the particular determined unobtrusiveness of someone who has decided they need to see something and has made themselves as unobtrusive as possible while seeing it. No one told him to leave. Colonel Haynes noticed him, assessed him, and said nothing. Marcus suspected Haynes had a better understanding of what was happening in Dylan Cross's professional reckoning than Dylan himself did. The first phase went cleanly. Lark flew the Falcon 7 through the lower test points with the methodical efficiency that Rachel had now come to read like a language. She watched the data feeds, and her pen moved in her notebook at intervals that corresponded not to test points, but to the moments when the data told her something worth writing. Twice, she said something quietly to the communications officer, who passed updated information to Lark. Both times, Lark acknowledged and made small adjustments. Both times, the subsequent data was slightly better than the test card baseline. Warren was watching this. I was watching Rachel watch the data, the way her eyes moved, the moment she chose to speak, the moment she chose not to. He was, Marcus realized, trying to learn something, not just about the aircraft, about the method. The way she processed what she was seeing and translated it into action at the precise moment action was needed and not before. At 11:03, the test sequence moved to the high-speed phase. The fuel balance protocol had been implemented. The updated flutter margins were in place. Lark had been briefed on every scenario Rachel had identified. The command center had the particular focused quality of a place where people have done their preparation and are now trusting it. Rachel set down her pen. She picked up the communications headset that the officer beside her had left available and put it on. This was not standard practice for an advisor. Nobody said anything about it. Lark's voice. Command entering high-speed test point alpha. Velocity increasing through test baseline. The data feeds updated. Velocity at test baseline plus 10. Systems nominal. Secondary control channel nominal. The numbers looked clean. Velocity at test baseline plus 20. Still clean. Test baseline plus 30. I'm seeing a brief pause. The kind of pause that in a test pilot's voice is not a pause. It is a controlled moment of processing. Vibration input, light. Secondary control showing command. I'm seeing the secondary control alert. Yellow band. The room moved, not physically, in attention. Every person's attention snapped to the data feed simultaneously. Warren said, "It's within the revised margin." Rachel said into the headset calmly and immediately, "Kevin, stop fighting it." The room went still, not because of what she said, because of how she said it. The first name, the certainty, the complete absence of hesitation or qualification. Lark's voice came back equally calm. Say again. The secondary system is starting the overcorrection loop. If you input counter-correction right now, you'll feed it. Don't fight it. Let the system complete the first correction cycle and wait for the damp. A beat, 2 beats, 3. In the command center, no one breathed correctly. Warren was looking at the data with the expression of a man watching a proof being written in real time that he cannot yet verify but is beginning to believe. Dylan Cross, standing near the back wall, had his hands flat against the wall behind him. Lark's voice, "I'm holding." System is, "I'm seeing the overcorrection." Amplitude is, "It'll peak and damp," Rachel said. Hold. 4 seconds of silence on the channel that felt like 4 minutes. Then Lark damping. Secondary control recovering. Alert clearing. A longer pause. Alert is cleared. System nominal. Velocity holding. The room let out a collective breath that was not quite audible but was completely felt. Rachel said, "Kevin, reduce velocity to test baseline and hold there. Let's get the data from this point before we go further." "Copy that. Reducing." A pause. "Command, are you getting what I'm getting on the secondary channel?" The overcorrection amplitude was higher than the revised model predicted. Warren was already at the data console, his chief engineer beside him, both of them moving with the urgent focus of people who have just seen their model wrong in a specific and important way. "We're seeing it," Warren said into his own headset. "We're logging everything." "Good." Lark's voice had the particular dry quality of a man who has just been very close to something and has come through it and is now processing both the experience and the professionalism. "I'd like to have a conversation with Miss Morgan when I'm back on the ground." "She'll be here," Haynes said. Rachel set down the headset. She picked up her pen. She made a note. Dylan Cross pushed off the wall and walked to the door of the command center. He stopped with his hand on the door frame. He was facing away from the room. Nobody could see his face. Marcus could see his shoulders. They were rigid, not with tension, with something harder to name, the particular rigidity of a person absorbing something they cannot argue with, cannot rank, cannot categorize in any framework they currently possess. He stood there for about 30 seconds. Then he turned around and walked back into the room. He walked directly to Rachel. She was writing in her notebook. She looked up when he reached her. He said, "How did you know what the loop would do?" It was the same question Lark had asked, but it wasn't the same question. The words were the same. The weight behind them was completely different. Lark had asked from the position of a pilot who needed operational information. Dylan was asking from somewhere else, from somewhere that cost him something to ask from. Rachel looked at him. "You want the real answer," she said. "Yes." "Not the professional answer." "No." She set her pen down. "I knew what the loop would do because I've held an aircraft through that loop, not in a simulator, not in a reconstruction, In an actual aircraft, in an actual emergency, when the person in the command center told me the wrong thing to do, and I did it and almost didn't come back. Dylan was very still. I figured out the right thing to do, she continued, about 2 seconds before it would have been too late to do it. And I swore that if I ever saw that situation again, from either side, I would know it immediately and I would say the right thing immediately, without hesitation, without waiting for the instruments to confirm what I already knew. She paused. That's the answer. Dylan said, how long ago? 11 years. You've been doing this for 11 years, the advisory work. I've been doing this for 11 years because an aircraft I was in nearly didn't come home, and I spent the next 11 years making sure I understood why and what to do about it and who else needed to know. Dylan looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, complicated and unresolved and more honest than anything he'd shown since she arrived. I laughed at your aircraft, he said. Yes. On the tarmac the first morning. I made sure you heard it. I know. He stopped. He was not a man who apologized easily. Marcus could see it wasn't easy. That was wrong. I want to be clear about that, not just professionally. It was wrong. Rachel looked at him for a long moment. I know what you saw when you looked at my aircraft, she said. You saw old equipment and assumed it meant old thinking. Or no thinking. She paused. I've been making that aircraft do things that newer aircraft can't for 11 years specifically because I needed to understand what an aircraft does when everything fails. You can't learn that from a new aircraft. New aircraft fail gracefully. Old ones fail honestly. Dylan absorbed this. The flat spin recovery and the demonstration, he said, that wasn't for the crowd. No, it was for us, for the pilots watching. It was for anyone watching who needed to see what a real recovery looks like, she said. What it looks like when the pilot isn't performing, when the pilot is remembering. The words sat there between them. Remembering. Marcus wrote it in his notebook. He didn't know exactly why. It just seemed important in a way that he wanted to be able to return to. When Lark landed the Falcon 7 at 11:52, he climbed out of the aircraft and walked into the command center, still in his flight suit, and went directly to Rachel. He shook her hand, not the formal handshake of professional acknowledgement, the handshake of someone who understands specifically what they are grateful for. The loop, he said, when I was holding through it, when you said stop fighting it, he paused. I trusted you because of the way you said it, not because I had time to analyze your reasoning. I know, she said. I want to understand the analysis, he said, afterward, for the report and for myself. He looked at her. But in that moment, I trusted the certainty in your voice. That's what it should work like, she said, when there isn't time for anything else. He nodded. He looked at her for another moment and then said, Ghostwriter. The name stopped the surrounding conversations within a 5-foot radius. Not loudly, just the way a name lands when it means something real to the people who hear it. Lark said it quietly to her alone, not to the room. I read one report, just one, 3 years ago during an accident review. Your call sign was in it, redacted but traceable if you knew what to look for. Rachel said nothing. You were on the right side of 2 aircraft emergencies that year, Lark said. 2 that I know about. Both recoveries that the official reports categorize as, and I'm quoting, exactly outcome inconsistent with expected parameters. Rachel said, meaning they expected the outcome to be worse. Meaning they expected the pilots not to come home, Lark said, flatly, precisely. And they came home. Rachel looked at him. Because of the person in the command center, he said. She said nothing for a moment. Then, because of the pilots, she said. The person in the command center told them what to do. The pilots had to do it. Both things are true, Lark said. She looked at him for a moment longer and then nodded once. Around them, the command center was returning to its post-event rhythm, data logging system, review the careful procedural work that follows a test that went close to an edge. But within a radius of about 20 feet, there was a different quality to the air. The quality of people who have just understood something they didn't understand before. Warren came to Rachel with a printed data sheet. The overcorrection amplitude, he said. At peak, it reached 83% of the revised flutter threshold. He paused. At the original planned test velocity, the amplitude would have exceeded threshold by approximately 15%. Rachel looked at the sheet. I want to document this formally, Warren said, or in the test report. The scenario you identified, the protocol you developed, the event as it occurred. He paused, with full attribution. Rachel handed the sheet back. Document the data, she said. The data is what matters. You're not interested in the attribution. She looked at him. Warren, I'm interested in the next aircraft that comes through a test program like this one, and the engineers who run that program having access to documented information about this specific failure mode. That's the attribution that matters, not my name in a report. Warren looked at her for a long moment. The engineer's face, precise and analytical, and underneath something that had not been there 2 days ago. I'll document both, he said, because if the next engineer who reads this report can trace the reasoning back to the experience that generated it, the information is more useful. Rachel considered this. That's good engineering, she said. I had a good example today, Warren said. He went back to his workstation. Marcus closed his notebook. He sat for a moment in the hum of the command center, thinking about the last 2 hours. About the headset Rachel had picked up without being asked. About the 9 words she had said to a test pilot in an unstable aircraft stop, fighting it. Let the system complete hold that had made the difference between a recovered test and something nobody in the room wanted to think about. 9 words. 11 years of not forgetting distilled into 9 words at the exact right moment. He looked across the room at Dylan Cross, who was standing alone near the data console looking at the feed from the Falcon 7's recovered systems. His face had the particular quality of a man rebuilding something from the ground up, not frantically, but necessarily, taking apart what he understood and looking at each piece and deciding what was worth keeping and what needed to be replaced. It was not a comfortable process. It was not supposed to be. Marcus thought about what Rachel had said in the cafeteria the night before. Good pilots sometimes wise ones. Sometimes they don't get the chance. Dylan had the chance. Marcus wasn't sure yet if Dylan knew that, but he thought he was beginning to. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Rachel left the command center to go back to her aircraft. Not for any operational reason. She went there the way some people go to a place that is theirs to think, to settle, to be in the presence of something reliable. She ran her hand along the fuselage, checked the restraints, looked at the propeller, did the things she always did when she needed to come back to something real. She heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around. Lieutenant Webb, she said. Marcus came to stand beside her. He looked at the 2 faded words. Major Lark said it, he said out loud, in the command center. Yes, he knew. He suspected there's a difference. Is there more, Marcus asked. More than 2 aircraft emergencies that year. She was quiet. You don't have to tell me, he said. I know, she said. She kept her hand on the fuselage. There's more. There's always more when you do this long enough. Is that why you walked away from it, from whatever Ghost Rider was? She turned and looked at him then. Really looked the way she sometimes did, like she was assessing not what he knew, but what he was ready for. I didn't walk away from it, she said. I'm standing here, aren't I? Marcus looked at the aircraft, looked at her. Then what did you walk away from? She turned back to the aircraft. The part where it required me to keep losing people, she said, in order to keep saving them. He didn't understand that fully. Not yet. But he wrote it in his notebook because he understood it was important and he would understand it later. She started rechecking the restraints she had already checked. He watched her for a moment. Ms. Morgan, he said, why did they send you here to Silver Ridge specifically? There are other bases, other programs. She worked through the restraint check without looking up. Because someone decided Silver Ridge had gotten comfortable, she said. Good pilots, good equipment, good records. Comfortable. She checked the last restraint, stood up. Comfortable is where accidents start. And Ghost Rider is what happens when comfortable ends. She looked at him. Ghost Rider, she said, is what happens when someone decides that knowing isn't enough, that you have to be present, that you have to be there with the information at the moment it matters, and you have to say the right thing in the right way, with enough certainty that a pilot in a deteriorating aircraft will trust you over their own instincts. She picked up her bag. That's not a call sign, she said. That's a job description. She walked away. Marcus stood beside the aircraft with the 2 faded words in the Nevada afternoon and the feeling that he was holding something significant in his hands that he didn't yet have the strength to fully lift. But he was getting there. The weight was becoming familiar. And somewhere in the base in a briefing room full of data and revised models and formal documentation being carefully prepared, the Falcon 7's test program was being rebuilt around information that had come from one woman's 11 years of not forgetting. And that information was about to change everything again. Not because of what it had already done. Because of what Rachel Morgan had noticed quietly in the last 30 seconds of looking at the recovered data that she hadn't said yet, that she was still deciding whether to say. Because some warnings arrive before the situation that requires them, and the timing of those warnings matters almost as much as the warnings themselves. She hadn't said it yet. That was what Marcus kept coming back to, sitting at his desk at 2 in the afternoon with his notebook open and the afternoon light coming in flat and honest across the page. Rachel had looked at the recovered data in the final 30 seconds before leaving the command center, and something had moved across her face. Not alarm, not certainty, something quieter and more careful than either of those. The expression of a person who has seen a shape in the data that they recognize but are not yet ready to name out loud. He knew that expression now. He had learned to read her face the way you learn to read weather, not perfectly. Not always in time, but with increasing accuracy and increasing respect for what it was telling you. She had seen something. She hadn't said it, and the question of why she hadn't said it was the thing sitting at the center of his afternoon like a stone in still water. He picked up his notebook and went to find her. She was not at her aircraft. She was not in the cafeteria. He checked the base library, a small room that most people used approximately never, and found her there alone at a corner table with 3 technical documents spread around her and her notebook open to a page dense with equations and cross-references. She looked up when he came in. She did not look surprised. "Close the door," she said. He did. He sat across from her. He looked at the documents. They were not the Falcon 7 materials. They were older. The paper had the particular texture of documents that had been handled many times, that had traveled somewhere and been read carefully and traveled again. "What are those?" he asked. "Accident reports," she said. 3 of them. Different programs, different years, different aircraft. She looked at him. Same underlying failure mode. He felt something cold move through his chest. "The same as what happened today." "Similar," she said carefully. "Not identical, but similar enough that when I saw today's data, I went back to these." She looked at the documents. "I've been carrying these for 6 years, in my bag, everywhere I go." Marcus looked at the worn edges of the documents, the creases, the particular softness of paper that has been folded and unfolded many times. 6 years, he said. 6 years ago, I was a part of an accident review board for a program that had a secondary control failure during a high-speed test. The pilot did not walk away. She said it plainly, without inflection, the way you have to say some things in order to say them at all. The review board concluded that the failure mode was specific to that aircraft's design and unlikely to appear in other programs. But you didn't agree. I agreed that it was specific to that aircraft's design. I did not agree that it was unlikely to appear in other programs. She touched the edge of one document, because I had already seen it twice before, in 2 different aircraft, 2 different programs, 2 different design teams. And each time, the review concluded it was specific and isolated. 3 times, Marcus said. 3 times. Same underlying mechanism. 3 different conclusions that it wouldn't happen again. Her voice was even. And then today. 4 times, Marcus said. 4 times. She looked at him. "Lieutenant, today the aircraft recovered. Today we had the fuel balance protocol and the revised flutter margins and a pilot who trusted the instruction to stop fighting. Today the outcome was good." "But," he said, because he could hear the weight behind the words she hadn't spoken. "But today I looked at the amplitude data from the overcorrection loop and I saw something that wasn't in the previous 3 incidents." She turned her notebook toward him. The loop's peak amplitude was higher than it should have been given the aircraft's current fuel state and load configuration. He looked at the numbers. He was good at this, better than average, better than Dylan would have given him credit for a week ago. He looked at the numbers and he found the anomaly she was pointing at. It peaked higher than the model predicted, even with the revised parameters. Yes. Which means the revised parameters are still not accounting for something. Yes, he sat back. What? She looked at her notebook. "I think there's a 4th variable. Something in the interaction between the secondary control system and the airframe's resonance frequency under specific load conditions. Something that doesn't appear in the models because the models don't include the airframe's real-world resonance behavior at these speeds. She paused. The airframe behaves differently than the computer model predicts. Slightly, but at this performance envelope, slightly is enough. Have you told Warren? Oh, not yet. Why not? She was quiet for a moment. Because I'm not certain, and because what I'm about to tell Dr. Warren, if I'm right, is not a correction to his model. It's a fundamental question about the test program's current parameters. Marcus understood the difference. A correction to a model was manageable. A fundamental question about the test program's parameters meant slowing down. It meant review. It meant the kind of delay that programs at this level with this much institutional investment resisted with enormous force. How certain are you? He asked. She looked at him. Certain enough that I can't not say it. He nodded slowly. When? This evening, she said. I want one more look at the data. I want to make sure I'm reading the resonance signature correctly before I bring it to Haynes. Is Lark scheduled in the aircraft tomorrow? Second test sequence 9 o'clock. She closed her notebook, which is why I need to be sure by this evening. He looked at the 3 accident reports, at the worn edges, at the 6 years of being carried. Ms. Morgan, he said, the pilot who didn't walk away 6 years ago. She didn't move. Did you know him? A pause. Yes. Well, another pause, longer. He was one of the best pilots I've ever seen fly. Better than Major Lark. Possibly better than anyone currently in this building. What was his name? She closed one of the documents carefully the way you close something precious. Daniel Reyes, she said. His call sign was Viper. The name settled in the room. He trusted the review board's conclusion, she said. The first incident, the second incident, he read both reports. He knew the design teams had concluded isolated and specific. He flew the 3rd aircraft in the program believing the risk had been analyzed. She paused. He was wrong to trust it. The board was wrong to conclude it. And I was wrong not to push harder when I saw the pattern. You were on the review board. I was the most junior member of the review board, she said. I raised my concern. I was overruled. I filed a dissent in the formal record, and I was told it would be noted. She looked at her hands. It was noted. And then Daniel flew the aircraft, and the loop didn't damp, and he did what your instincts tell you to do in that situation, which is exactly the wrong thing, and he didn't come home. The room was very quiet. That's why you carry those, Marcus said. I carry those, she said, so that I never again walk into a room with a revised model and a good test sequence and a confident engineering team and fail to say the thing that needs to be said because I'm worried about being overruled. You're not worried about that now. No, she said. I stopped being worried about that 6 years ago. She gathered the documents. She stacked them carefully and put them back in her bag. She picked up her notebook. Go get some rest, Lieutenant, she said. I'll have what I need by tonight, and tomorrow is going to require everyone to be very clear-headed. He stood. He was almost at the door when she said, Marcus. He stopped. It was the first time she had used his first name. You're going to be a good pilot, she said. You already pay attention to the right things. Don't let anyone train that out of you. He held that for a moment. How do I make sure they don't? She looked at him. Stay curious longer than it's comfortable. Most pilots stop being curious when they get good. Don't do that. He nodded. He went. He did not go to rest. He went to find Dylan Cross. Dylan was in the gym alone, working through a series of movements with the focused intensity of a man who needs to be in his body because his mind is giving him trouble. Marcus sat on a bench and waited. Dylan finished what he was doing, picked up a towel, and sat down. She saw something in the data, Marcus said. This afternoon. She didn't say it in the command center. Dylan looked at him. What did she see? She thinks there's a 4th variable in the failure mode, something the revised model still isn't capturing. She's going to bring it to Haynes tonight. Dylan absorbed this. What kind of 4th variable? Airframe resonance. Real-world behavior under load at high speed that doesn't match the model's predictions. Dylan was quiet for a moment. Then if she's right, tomorrow's test sequence needs to be suspended until it's analyzed. Dylan leaned forward, elbows on knees. Warren's team is going to push back. Warren's team pushed back yesterday, Marcus said. They were wrong yesterday. Dylan looked at the floor. His jaw was working. She was right about the flutter threshold. She was right about the fuel balance protocol. She was right about the overcorrection loop. He paused. She's been right about everything. Yes. And I called her aircraft garbage. He said it flatly, the way you say something you need to hear yourself say in order to fully register what it means. First morning, on the tarmac, in front of everyone. Yes. Dylan was quiet for a long time. The gym was empty around them. Late afternoon. Most people at dinner are in debrief. Marcus, he said, how does someone get to where she is, where you know things that aren't in the documentation, where you can hear an aircraft loop in the data and know what it's going to do before the instruments finish showing you? Marcus thought about the 3 Warren accident reports, about Daniel Reyes, about 6 years of carrying something because you didn't push hard enough once and someone didn't come home. You pay for it, Marcus said, and you don't forget what you paid. Dylan looked at him. That's not a path I'm going to volunteer for, Dylan said. No, Marcus said. Nobody volunteers for it, but you can choose what you do with what it teaches you. He paused. That's the part she chose. Dylan nodded slowly. He picked up the towel again. Then he set it down. I'm going to talk to her, he said, tonight, before she goes to Haynes. Why, Bellen? Because I have something to say to her that I should have said 2 days ago, and because I want to be in that room when she talks to Haynes, if she'll allow it. Why would she allow it? Dylan looked at him. She might not, but I'm going to ask. He stood up. Dylan, Marcus said. Dylan stopped. She told me today that you're a good pilot. She said it sincerely before I told her what I just told you. Dylan absorbed that. His face moved through something complicated and landed somewhere honest. That makes it worse, he said. I know, Marcus said. It's supposed to. Dylan found Rachel at her aircraft at 6:15 in the evening. She was there the way she had been the previous evening, running her hands along the surfaces, checking things that were already checked, being present with the machine that was in some important way the most constant relationship in her professional life. She heard him coming and didn't turn. Captain Cross, she said. Ms. Morgan. He stopped about 6 feet from her. The Nevada evening was moving in the air, cooling the light, going amber and long. I need to say something. She kept her hand on the fuselage. All right. I was wrong, he said. Not just unprofessional, not just rude. Wrong in a way that goes deeper than courtesy. He paused. I looked at you and your aircraft and I made a complete judgment in about 30 seconds. I decided you were less than me. Not just less experienced, less serious, less worthy of this space. He stopped. Started again. I've been a pilot for 7 years. I have never in 7 years met anyone who understands what's happening in an aircraft the way you do. And instead of recognizing that I used it as material for a joke, Rachel had turned to look at him. She was listening with the full attention she gave everything, not performing listening, actually listening. He said, I'm sorry. That's the whole thing. I'm sorry. She looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that takes stock of a person, not for their rank or their record, but for what they're actually made of. Thank you, she said. That took something. Not as much as it should have, he said honestly, which is its own problem. She almost smiled. Almost. You know what the hardest thing about being wrong is? What? It's not the apology, it's the update. Changing what you actually believe, not just what you say. That's the slow part. That's the part that hurts. I know, he said. I'm in the middle of it. Good, she said. Stay in it. Don't rush out the other side. He nodded. Then, Marcus told me you found something in the data today, something you were taking to Haynes tonight. Yes. I want to be there if you'll allow it. She studied him. Why though? Because whatever you're going to say to Haynes is going to be hard to say and possibly harder to hear. And because I want to be on the right side of it, not for credit, not to be useful. He paused. Because I've spent 2 days watching you do something that I thought I understood and clearly didn't, and I don't want to be the person standing outside the room anymore. Rachel looked at him for a long moment. Be at Haynes's office at 8 o'clock, she said. Don't be late. I won't. She turned back to her aircraft. He turned to leave, then stopped. Miss Morgan, can I ask you one more thing? Go ahead. Daniel Reyes. She went very still. Marcus didn't tell me, he said quickly. I heard the name the accident review 6 years ago was discussed in a program briefing I attended 2 years back. His name was in the summary. Viper. He paused. Did you know him before the accident? She was quiet for a full 10 seconds. We flew together, she said, early in my career, before the call signs, before any of this. We were in the same training group. A pause. He was the one who first told me I flew like a recovery pilot. He meant it as a compliment. He was always better at seeing people clearly than I was. I'm sorry, Dylan said, and meant it the same way he'd meant the apology. Completely. So am I, she said. Every day. He left her with her aircraft. He walked back across the tarmac, and he thought about 7 years of being told he was exceptional and what that had cost him in terms of the things he hadn't learned because he was too busy being certain. It had cost him something he couldn't fully measure yet, but he was starting to understand the size of it. At 8 o'clock sharp, Dylan Cross was outside Colonel Haynes's office. Rachel arrived at 7:58. She looked at him, registered that he was there, and knocked on the door. Haynes called them in. Major Lark was there. Warren was there, Warren's chief engineer. The base's chief safety officer, a lieutenant colonel named Brenda Vasquez, who had the efficient, undecorated manner of someone who has spent a career making decisions that matter and has no patience for decisions that don't. Rachel set her notebook on Haynes's desk and opened it to the relevant page. I need to walk through something I found in this afternoon's data, she said. I want everyone in this room to look at it before I state my conclusion. She walked them through it. The amplitude anomaly, the resonance frequency discrepancy, the comparison to the 3 previous incidents. She laid it out in the precise sequential way that she did everything, not to persuade, but to show, to make it possible for the people in the room to reach the conclusion themselves if they followed the evidence. Warren followed it. He got there about 30 seconds before she stated it explicitly, and the expression on his face when he arrived was the expression of a man who has been hit with something he cannot argue with for the 3rd time in 3 days and is running out of resources for resistance. His chief engineer got there at the same time Lark got there, and his face went through something that a pilot's face goes through when they understand in technical terms what they were sitting inside that morning. Vasquez got there, and her face did not change, but she picked up a pen and began writing immediately. My recommendation, Rachel said, is to suspend the high-speed test sequence until the airframe resonance behavior is fully characterized under load. That characterization needs to happen on the ground through structural testing before Major Lark goes back into the high-speed envelope. She stopped speaking. The room was quiet. Warren said, the structural testing you're describing will take a minimum of 2 weeks. Probably 3, Rachel said, depending on what the characterization shows. The program and timeline, Colonel Haynes said. He stopped. Haynes looked at the notebook. She looked at Rachel. She looked at Lark. Major Lark, you were in the aircraft. You felt what the data is showing. Does Ms. Morgan's interpretation match your experience of the event? Lark said, the amplitude at peak felt higher than the system should have been capable of at that test point. I noticed it in the moment. I didn't have a framework for understanding why. He looked at Rachel's notebook. This framework explains it. Haynes said, Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez. Vasquez didn't look up from her notes. If the resonance characterization supports Ms. Morgan's analysis, flying the high-speed envelope before completing it would represent an unacceptable safety risk. Recommendation to suspend is correct. She looked up. If it doesn't support the analysis, we lose 3 weeks. That's an acceptable loss compared to the alternative. The alternative. Nobody said what the alternative was. Nobody needed to. Haynes looked at the room. She made the decision with the particular efficiency of a person who knows how to make decisions and does not add unnecessary weight to them. We suspend the high-speed sequence pending structural characterization. Dr. Warren, I want your team's testing protocol on my desk by tomorrow morning. Ms. Morgan, I'd like you involved in developing that protocol if you're willing to extend your stay. I'll stay, Rachel said. Good. Haynes looked at Dylan Cross, who had stood quietly near the wall through all of this. Captain Cross, you haven't said anything. Dylan said, I didn't have anything to add, ma'am. Ms. Morgan said everything that needed saying. Haynes looked at him for a moment. Something in her face suggested she found this significant. See that you remember that feeling, and she said, it's useful. Yes, ma'am, he said. They filed out. In the hallway, Warren stopped beside Rachel. The resonance variable, he said. If I'd had this analysis before the program began, you didn't have it, she said. Nobody had it written down. That's the problem. She looked at him. After the structural testing, I'd like to write it up formally. Not just the variable itself, but the pattern across the 4 incidents. A documented framework that future programs can reference. Warren looked at her. I'll co-author it. She looked at him. Yes, she said. I think you should. They shook hands, not the formal handshake of professional acknowledgement, something closer to the handshake that Lark had given her that afternoon. The handshake that means I understand now what I didn't understand before, and I'm not going to forget it. In the hallway, Dylan was waiting. Rachel walked past him and then slowed without stopping. He fell into step beside her. They walked for a moment in silence. 3 weeks, he said. At least. You're staying? Yes. When how was quiet. Then why Silver Ridge? I know what you told Marcus about comfortable, but there are other bases that have gotten comfortable. Why here? She walked for another few steps. Because someone I trust told me Silver Ridge had a generation of pilots who were technically excellent and experientially limited, who had learned to perform without learning what performance costs when it fails. She paused. And because that same person told me there were 1 or 2 of them who might be worth the time. Dylan was quiet for a moment. How many were worth the time? She looked at him sideways. Ask me in 3 weeks. She turned down a corridor and was gone. Dylan stood in the hallway alone. He thought about technically excellent and experientially limited and let it sit on him the way accurate descriptions sit with the particular discomfort of something true. Then he thought about something she had said to him at the aircraft. Stay in the middle of the update. Don't rush out the other side. He was in it. He could feel the size of what he didn't know in a way he had never felt before, because you cannot feel the size of what you don't know until someone opens a door and you see the room and understand that the room has been there the entire time and you simply didn't know the door existed. The room was large. He was going to need time in it. I went back to his quarters. He sat at his desk. He opened his own logbook, not the official one, the personal one, the one he'd kept since his first solo flight, and he turned to a fresh page. He wrote, there is a difference between flying well and flying wisely. He stared at it for a moment. Then he wrote, I have been flying well. He put the pen down. Outside somewhere on the other side of the base, Rachel Morgan was at her desk with her notebook and the 3 worn accident reports in her own particular way of preparing for what came next. She was not thinking about Dylan Cross or Warren or the 3 weeks of structural testing or the paper she and Warren would eventually write together. She was thinking about the resonance characterization protocol, about the testing sequence, about the specific load conditions and velocity ranges that would most efficiently map the behavior she had identified in the data. She was thinking about the work, the way she always had, the way Ghostwriter always had. Because the work was the thing. It was always the thing, not the recognition, not the name spoken with respect in quiet hallways, not the handshakes of grateful pilots or the concessions of corrected engineers. The work, the data, the question of what happens when everything goes wrong and whether the person who needs the right answer can get it in time. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. She began to write. And in the quiet of the Nevada night, with the aircraft secured and the base settled, and 3 weeks of necessary work ahead of her, Ghostwriter did what Ghostwriter had always done. She prepared for everything, for the mission nobody had planned for the moment that would arrive the way these moments always arrived, without announcement, without warning, without the courtesy of arriving on schedule. Ready, always ready, even when no one was watching. Especially then, the 3 weeks passed the way difficult, necessary things passed, not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular weight of work that matters done carefully by people who have finally understood why it matters. The structural testing began the morning after Haynes's meeting. Warren's team built the protocol with Rachel's direct input, and the result was a testing sequence that was more thorough than anything the Falcon 7 program had originally planned for. It was also, Warren said quietly to his chief engineer on the second day, the most rigorous characterization work he had done in 22 years in aerospace. His chief engineer said, because of her. Warren said, because of what she made us understand we didn't know. The distinction mattered to him. He had spent 22 years being the person in the room who understood the most. He was recalibrating what that meant, and the recalibration was not comfortable, but he was doing it with the same precision he applied to everything else, which was the only way Warren knew how to do anything. Rachel was present for most of the testing, not hovering, not directing, present in the way she was always present, available, attentive, and saying things at the exact moment they needed to be said, and not before. On the 4th day of testing, the resonance characterization confirmed what she had identified in the data. The airframe's real-world resonance frequency under asymmetric high-speed load differed from the model by 11%. In two specific load configurations, that difference pushed the secondary control flutter threshold into a range that the revised model had considered safe. It was not safe. Warren stood in front of that data for a long time. Then he said, "3 weeks ago, I would have told you this finding was impossible." Rachel said, "3 weeks ago, your model didn't include the real-world resonance data." "No," he said, "it didn't." He looked at the numbers. "It also would have been impossible 3 weeks ago for me to admit that my model had a gap this significant." Rachel looked at him. "What changed?" I thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything, carefully, precisely, without rushing to an answer that hadn't been fully earned. "You didn't argue with me," he said finally. "Every time I pushed back, you showed me data. You never made it about being right, you made it about the aircraft." He paused. "That's a harder thing to resist than an argument." "I know," she said. "I learned that the hard way." He looked at her. Reyes. She had told him about Daniel Reyes on the 6th day of testing in a quiet moment, when they were alone with the data and the question of why the review board had concluded. What it had concluded was relevant to understanding how to prevent the same mistake in future reviews. She had told it the way she told everything, plainly, with precision, without performing the grief but not hiding it either. Warren had listened without interrupting. He had asked two technical questions at the end, both directly relevant and both showing that he had heard everything she said. He had not offered condolences, which she respected, because condolences were not what the story was for. Now he said, "I think about him, the Reyes case. I didn't know him, I've never been in that program, but I think about what the review board saw and what they didn't see and what they chose to conclude." "So do I," she said, "every day." "Does it get lighter?" She thought about the question honestly. "No," she said, "it gets more useful. That's different." He nodded. He went back to his data. On the 8th day, Dylan Cross did something that surprised everyone who noticed it, which was most people. He asked Rachel if he could observe the testing. Not officially, not as part of his duties. He simply asked directly if she would allow him to be present during the structural analysis sessions. She said yes, without hesitation. He came every day after that. He sat where he was told to sit, which was against the wall, and he watched with the focused attention of someone who has decided to learn something and is willing to be a beginner in order to do it. He asked questions when the session paused, and he asked them the right way, specific, technical, without the overlay of needing to appear already competent. On the 3rd day of his observation, Warren's chief engineer said to Warren, "Cross is different." Warren said yes. What happened to him? Warren thought about it. "He found the ceiling," he said. "Some pilots find it and get angry. Some get quiet and go looking for the next ceiling." He looked at Dylan across the room. "I think he's going to be the second kind." On the 11th day, Rachel called Dylan over during a break and showed him something in the testing data. She walked him through the resonance pattern, the way it built under load, the specific frequency range where the aircraft's real behavior diverged from the model's prediction. He followed it. Not perfectly, it was outside his current technical depth, but he followed it far enough to see the shape of what she was showing him. He said, "You see this in real time. When the aircraft is flying, you see this in the data while it's happening." "Yes," she said. Because I know what I'm looking for," she said. "And I know what I'm looking for because I've seen what happens when this pattern appears and gets ignored. It's not a gift, Dylan. It's a debt. Every time I see it now, I'm seeing it partly because Daniel Reyes didn't come home, and I was there, and I have been paying attention ever since." I was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard way to learn." "Yes," she said, "it is, which is why I'm here. So you don't have to learn it the same way." He held that. "What do I need to do?" he said. "Specifically, to be the kind of pilot who sees what you see. Not at your level, I understand that's years, and I understand what those years cost. But to start." She looked at him. It was the most important question he had asked since she arrived, and she could tell by his face that he knew it. "Stop being afraid of not knowing," she said. "You've spent 7 years performing competence so continuously that you've started confusing the performance with the thing itself. Competence isn't a performance, it's a practice. You practice it by being wrong, by seeing what being wrong costs, and by caring more about not being wrong the next time than about looking right this time." He took it without flinching. "You're describing the last 2 weeks." "Yes," she said. "You've been doing it. You just needed to know that's what it's called and that it doesn't stop. He nodded slowly. It doesn't stop. No, she said. That's actually the whole thing. The day you decide you're done learning is the day the aircraft stops forgiving you. He looked at her. Ghostwriter, he said. What about it? The call sign. Where did it come from? She was quiet for a moment. Daniel gave it to me, she said, after the first time I talked a pilot through an emergency from the command center. He said I sounded like a rider who stays on when the horse is going to throw everyone else. She paused. I told him it was a terrible metaphor for aviation. Dylan almost smiled. What did he say? He said all the best call signs are terrible metaphors. She looked at her notebook. He was right about that too. The structural testing concluded on day 17, 3 days ahead of the minimum estimate. The resonance characterization produced a data set that Warren said, without irony or concession, was the most valuable single contribution to the Falcon 7 program since its inception. He said it in a formal session with Haynes and the full evaluation team, and he said it clearly and on record. Rachel was in the room. She did not react outwardly. But Marcus, watching from his usual position near the wall, saw her hand tighten briefly on her notebook. He understood. This was not what it cost to do what she did. But it was something. It was the data surviving. It was Daniel Reyes's absence contributing to an outcome that might prevent another absence. It was the debt being paid forward in the only currency that actually mattered. He wrote in his notebook, the debt being paid forward. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he wrote, this is what the name means. The night before Lark's return to the high-speed test sequence, now rebuilt with the full resonance characterization incorporated, new flutter margins, updated procedures, a checklist that Rachel had reviewed line by line with Lark and Haynes and Warren, until every person in the room could have recited it in their sleep. Rachel did something she had not done since arriving at Silver Ridge. She went to the flight line alone late after most of the base had settled into the quiet of a Nevada night, and she flew. Not a demonstration, not a test. She took her aircraft up in the dark and flew the way people fly when they are not performing for anyone, when they are simply in conversation with the machine and the air, in the particular state of being airborne that cannot be fully described to anyone who hasn't experienced it. She flew for 40 minutes. Ortega was on the late shift. He watched the aircraft's lights moving in the darkness above the base, unhurried, precise, doing things in the dark that most pilots wouldn't attempt in daylight, and he felt something that he would not have been able to name easily, but that had something to do with watching a person be completely themselves in the element that was entirely theirs. When she landed and taxied back, he was waiting with a cup of coffee. She climbed out and took it. They stood together in the way they had stood together that first morning, beside the aircraft in the quiet. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed. You ready? She looked at him. I've been ready for 11 years, she said. That's sort of the whole thing. He nodded. He understood that, better than most people would have. Sergeant Ortega, she said, first morning, when I asked you which kind of pilot you thought I was. Recovery pilot, he said. You got it right in about 30 seconds. She drank her coffee. Most people take longer. I've worked around enough aircraft to know what the checklist looks like when someone's doing it because they have to, and what it looks like when someone's doing it because they can't afford not to. He paused. Yours looked like you couldn't afford not to. No, she said, I can't. He took her cup when she was done. She secured the aircraft. He helped without being asked the way he had helped on that first day, and they worked together in the comfortable silence of two people who understand each other's relationship with a machine and don't need to perform that understanding. When they were done, she picked up her bag. Thank you, she said, for the first day, for the coffee, for not asking questions. You answered the important ones, he said. She nodded once and walked away across the tarmac. Ortega watched her go. Then he looked at the aircraft, at the two faded words, Ghostwriter. He had looked up that call sign 11 times over the past 3 weeks. He had found different things each time, not more exactly, but deeper. References that led to other references. A forum post from a former test pilot who had written simply, if you ever find yourself in a bad aircraft and Ghostwriter is in your headset, do exactly what she says. Don't think. Don't argue. Just do it. I'm alive because of that rule. He had read that post 6 times. He looked at the aircraft one more time. Then he went back to work. The morning of Lark's return to the high-speed sequence arrived with the clear, cold clarity of a Nevada dawn, that felt to the people in the command center like it was aware of its own significance. The pre-flight sequence ran with the fuel balance protocol, the resonance-informed flutter margins, the updated secondary control monitoring thresholds. Lark ran through his checks with Rachel, present the two of them going through the checklist in the quiet, efficient way of people who have had the important conversations and no longer need the air between them filled with anything except the work. At one point, Lark said, "If the loop starts again," "It won't," Rachel said, "not if the characterization held. But if it does, same instruction. Stop fighting it. Wait for the damp. The damp will come. And if it doesn't come," she looked at him, "then you'll hear my voice before you have time to be afraid. And you do what I say." He looked at her for a moment. "You've said that to pilots before." "Yes." "Did they always make it?" She was quiet for a second. "Almost always," she said. "The ones who listened always." He nodded. He pulled on his helmet. "Ghost Rider," he said. "Get in the aircraft, Major Lark," she said. "Bring it home." He got in the aircraft. The command center was fully staffed. Warren's complete team. Vasquez, Haynes, Marcus. Dylan standing near the back with his arms at his sides and his face completely open in a way Marcus had never seen it before, not performing calm, actually present. Rachel put on the headset. She opened her notebook. She wrote the time at the top of the page, 09:14. Lark taxied to the runway. He lifted off with a clean crosswind correction that Rachel watched and said nothing about because there was nothing to say. He climbed on profile. His voice came through the headset at each test point, steady, professional. The voice of a man who has thought clearly about risk and made his peace with it and is now simply doing his job. The low-speed sequence went cleanly. The mid-speed sequence went cleanly. At 10:07, Lark called, "Command entering high-speed sequence. Velocity increasing through test baseline." The room held its breath, not in fear, in attention, the specific quality of attention that trained people give to things that matter. Test baseline +10, all systems nominal. Secondary control nominal, no flutter indication. The data feeds were clean. Test baseline +20, nominal, no resonance signature. Still clean, cleaner actually than the first test 3 weeks ago. The updated margins were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. Rachel was watching the data with the same eyes she always watched data with, not hoping, not fearing. Reading. Test baseline +30, a pause that lasted exactly as long as the altitude announcement required. Command all systems nominal. Secondary control is clean, no flutter, no resonance anomaly. Another pause. She's flying beautifully up here. The command center did not erupt. Military rooms don't erupt. But Warren made a sound, not quite a word, something involuntary and quiet, and put both hands flat on the console in front of him. And his chief engineer put a hand briefly on his shoulder, and Vasquez wrote something in her notebook with a period at the end of it that seemed to carry weight. Haynes said into her headset, "Outstanding, Major Lark. Continue the sequence." Rachel set down her pen. She closed her notebook. She looked at the data for another 30 seconds, reading, checking, making certain, and then she took off the headset and set it on the console. She turned to find Dylan Cross standing 6 feet behind her. He had moved from the back of the room at some point during the test sequence. She hadn't noticed. She noticed now. His face was not the face she had first seen on the tarmac. Not the face that had laughed and pointed and made sure the joke landed in front of an audience. It was not even the face of the man who had apologized at her aircraft or stood quietly in Haynes's office. It was a newer face, one being built in real time from different materials. "Clean," he said. "Clean," she said, "because of the work you did. Because of the work we all did," she said. "Warren's team, Vasquez, Lark, you." She paused. "Even you, Cross. You sat against the wall for 11 days and you asked the right questions and you didn't pretend to know things you didn't know. That matters more than you realize right now." He took that in. "I have a long way to go." "Yes," she said, "you do." "Will you?" He stopped. "I know you're leaving when the evaluation closes, but will you?" He stopped again. Not from uncertainty, from the difficulty of asking something that mattered honestly. "Write it down," she said. "Whatever you want to know how to do, write it down specifically and send it to me. I'll answer." He looked at her. "You'll answer?" "I answer everyone who writes down the right question," she said. "Most people don't take the time to write it down specifically. The ones who do are the ones worth answering." He nodded once, the nod of someone making a commitment. Ms. Morgan, he said, one more question. Go ahead. The first morning, on the tarmac, when I grabbed your aircraft's strut and shook it, he paused, and you put your hand where mine had been. He paused again. What were you thinking? She looked at him for a long moment. I was thinking, she said, that I'd met pilots like you before, and that some of them became the most important people in aviation I ever worked with, and that the only way to know which kind you were going to be was to stay long enough to find out. He absorbed that. And he said, and I'm glad I stayed, she said. She picked up her notebook and her bag. She walked to the door. She stopped. She turned back, not to Dylan specifically, but to the room. To Warren and his team bent over the data feeds. To Vasquez still writing in her notebook. To Haynes standing at the center of it all with the particular authority of someone who makes right decisions quietly. To Marcus near the wall, notebook open, pen in hand, watching everything with the focused attention of someone who has understood that watching carefully is a form of skill. She looked at them all for a moment. She didn't say anything. She turned and walked out. Marcus followed her into the hallway. You're leaving today, he said. It wasn't a question. Flight leaves at 4, she said. The evaluation doesn't formally close until Friday. Warren doesn't need me for the data processing. Haynes doesn't need me for the report. Lark doesn't need me for the remaining test points. She looked at him. My job here is done. He walked beside her for a moment. Ms. Morgan, what happens now for you after Silver Ridge? There's a program in Ohio, she said. New trainer aircraft. The test sequence starts in 6 weeks. They asked me to consult on the recovery analysis. Another Ghost Rider mission. Another program where someone needs to know what the models don't know yet, she said. Same as always. I was quiet for a moment. Then, you said something to me the first week in the library. He opened his notebook. He read, someone has to remember what the models don't know yet. Yes, she said. Is that the whole job, remembering? She thought about it, genuinely thought about it the way she always thought about real questions. Remembering and being present, she said. Remembering is the knowledge. Being present is the delivery. You can have the knowledge and not be in the room when it's needed, and the knowledge is worth nothing. She paused. That's the other reason I do the advisory work. It's not enough to know. You have to be there, in the command center, with the headset, at the moment. Always ready, he said. Always ready, she said. They had reached the door to the outside. She stopped. She turned and looked at him. The full look. The look she gave things she was serious about. Lieutenant Weber, she said, you're going to have a career that matters. Not because you're talented, you are, but that's not why. Because you already understand that what you don't know is more important than what you do. Hold on to that. When they start telling you you're exceptional, hold on to that harder. She paused. It's harder to hold on to when people are telling you you're exceptional. That's when most people let go. He held her gaze. I won't let go. Write it down, she said. What I just said. Put it somewhere you'll see it in 10 years. He looked down at his notebook. He wrote it while she watched, word for word. When he looked up, she was almost smiling. Good, she said. She walked out. He stood in the doorway and watched her cross the tarmac to her aircraft. The old truck waiting the trailer, already positioned. The aircraft that had started this whole thing sitting in the Nevada sun, with its faded paint and its 2 barely visible words and its years of honest service in situations that didn't make the public record. Ortega was there. He helped her load the aircraft without being asked, the way he'd helped with everything else. And the two of them worked with the quiet efficiency of people who have an understanding that doesn't require words. Marcus watched until the truck reached the main gate. Then he went back inside. He found Dylan in the briefing room alone at a desk with a piece of paper in front of him and a pen in his hand. He was writing, not quickly, deliberately, choosing words. Marcus sat down across from him. What are you writing? Marcus asked. Dylan kept writing for another moment. Then he set the pen down and pushed the paper toward Marcus. It was a list, specific, technical, ordered. Questions about emergency recovery procedures, about command center communication protocols, about the gap between aircraft performance models and real-world behavior. Each question precise. Each question clearly the product of 3 weeks of watching and listening and letting what he didn't know become visible to him. At the bottom, he had written an email address, Rachel Morgan's. You're sending it, Marcus said. Tonight, Dylan said. Marcus looked at the list, counted the questions. 14, each one better than the one before it. Each one the question of someone who has started to understand what they don't know and has decided that understanding is more important than concealing. She said she answers the ones who write down the right question, Marcus said. I know, Dylan said. I was there. Are those the right questions? Dylan picked up the paper, looked at it. I think so, he said. I think they're the most honest questions I've ever asked about flying. Then she'll answer, Marcus said. Dylan had folded the paper carefully. He put it in his breast pocket. The Falcon 7 test program concluded successfully 4 days later. The full resonance characterization was incorporated into the final test report, along with Warren's formal documentation of the secondary control failure mode across all 4 incidents, including the one that had taken Daniel Reyes. The report was thorough, precise, and included a framework section that Warren and Rachel had drafted together over the phone in the evenings during the final days of testing. The framework section was titled, Known Gaps in Current Flutter Modeling Across Program Analysis. It was classified, but it went into the review materials for every high-performance aircraft program currently in development. Vasquez sent a copy to 6 other bases. Haynes wrote a memo recommending that the civilian advisory role Rachel had filled be formalized into a standing position in future high-performance evaluations. Warren submitted a paper to the Journal of Aerospace Engineering. He listed Rachel Morgan as the primary author. She asked him to remove her name. He argued for 2 phone calls. On the 3rd call, she agreed to a co-author credit. The paper used the call sign in one place, not as a name, not as a title, but as a reference in the acknowledgments section. Brief and precise methodology informed by operational experience, documented under classification reference, ghostwriter. That was enough. That was more than enough. Dylan Cross received a reply to his email 14 days after he sent it. It was longer than he expected, and it answered every question specifically, and then asked him 3 questions in return, each one harder than anything on his list, each one designed to push the boundary of what he currently understood. He stared at those 3 questions for a long time. Then he got out a piece of paper and started writing. Marcus Webb was promoted 8 months later. At his promotion ceremony, he kept his notebook in his breast pocket, the page with the 2 words recovery pilot, the page with what Rachel had said about remembering and being present, the page with her instruction, hold on to that harder when they tell you you're exceptional. He held on to it. Ortega retired from the Air Force 2 years after Rachel left Silver Ridge. He went back to civilian aerobatics. He became a safety consultant for small aerobatic programs. In his first consultation session with a new group of civilian performers, he said, there are 2 kinds of pilots, show pilots and recovery pilots. The best ones know the difference. And then he told them about the woman who arrived in an old truck with a faded flight suit and did a flat spin recovery at low altitude for a room full of people who thought they already knew everything about flying. He told the story the way it deserved to be told. The name ghostwriter got used only once in that session, but nobody who heard it forgot it. Years later at Silver Ridge, new pilots came through their training rotations and heard the story told differently by different people with different details, emphasized the way stories travel and accumulate meaning as they move. Some versions focused on the flat spin recovery, some focused on the Falcon 7 test, some focused on the conversation in Haynes's office. All versions said the same thing at the center. She came in an old truck with an aircraft most people thought was a museum piece, and she was right about everything that mattered. Before anyone else in the room knew there was something to be right about. And every version said the name, Ghostwriter. Not because the name was legend, not because the missions were myth, because the name meant something specific and true and earned in the hardest possible way. It meant when the aircraft stops cooperating and the instruments are lying and the instincts are wrong and the model is insufficient and the margin is gone. And everything that was supposed to prevent this moment has failed to prevent this moment. There is a voice in the headset, steady, certain, ready knowing what you need to do. And if you listen, really listen the way Rachel Morgan had spent 11 years making sure pilots would listen, you come home. That was the whole story. That was what Rachel Morgan built from loss and carried forward and delivered precisely at the exact moments it was needed. Not a reputation, not a legend, a practice, a method, a form of devotion to the truth that aircraft tell when they are in trouble and to the pilots who need to hear that truth in time. Ghost Rider was never about the name. Ghost Rider was about being present when it counted, knowing what the models didn't know yet, and making sure that the next pilot and the one after that and the one after that came home. And they did, because she was there, because she was always there. That was enough. That was everything.